The electric streetcar and passenger rail network that once carried millions across American cities and countryside was stripped down through a mix of corporate maneuvering, a toothless antitrust outcome, and a federal highway program that redirected the nation's investment. Official records show National City Lines, backed by General Motors, Firestone, Standard Oil, and Mack Trucks, was prosecuted by the Department of Justice and convicted in 1949 for conspiring to monopolize the sale of buses and supplies, a verdict that brought only modest fines. 5 years later, the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 authorized about $25 billion to build roughly 41 miles of interstate highways, funded by the new Highway Trust Fund and a federal fuel tax, reshaping freight and passenger flow. In the next minutes, you'll follow court transcripts, company memos, and federal budgets to see how policy choices and corporate strategy combine to reroute American mobility, and why the consequences still affect rail policy, urban life, and climate debates today. If you care about how infrastructure decisions are made and who benefits, this is the paper trail that explains the railroad's fall and what it means for rebuilding transit now. The corporate sabotage. National City Lines was financed and backed by a cartel of suppliers whose names are on every corporate balance sheet of mid-century America. General Motors, Firestone Tire, Standard Oil interests, and truck makers among them. Federal prosecutors later proved that those suppliers not only sold buses and parts, they bought controlling interests in local transit companies and steered procurement back to themselves. The Department of Justice brought a criminal case that resulted in convictions for conspiring to monopolize the sale of buses and supplies, and the companies involved were levied only nominal fines. Penalties that, on paper, looked punitive but in practice barely dented corporate coffers. Corporate playbooks were straightforward and systematic. Shell holding companies and local subsidiaries acquired streetcar and interurban operators in dozens of municipalities, then accelerated the retirement of fixed-rail equipment and infrastructure while replacing it with buses purchased from their investor manufacturers. Procurement contracts shifted rapidly to affiliated suppliers for buses, tires, and fuel. Documents entered as evidence in the DOJ trial showed coordinated sales strategies and internal memos emphasizing opportunities to expand bus markets at the expense of electric rail. The result was vendor lock-in. Once transit lines depended on internally sourced buses and parts, local municipalities faced fresh capital expenses they could not easily avoid. The federal policy context amplified corporate choices. The National Highway Program, championed by the administration of the day, committed massive public investment to road construction, creating both a market and a narrative that favored automobiles and trucks over rail. Congress authorized a multi-billion-dollar coast-to-coast interstate system and furnished long-term financing mechanisms that made highway building the centerpiece of American transportation policy. That infusion of federal money changed urban planning priorities, shifted freight to trucks on new limited-access highways, and gave local leaders political cover to favor bus conversions and road projects over expensive maintenance or modernization of rail lines. Consequences followed quickly and unevenly. Passenger rail services were pared back as private railroads shed money-losing routes. Urban transit networks that once centered on electric streetcars became bus-dominant and fragmented. Ridership patterns changed, and public subsidies began flowing overwhelmingly to highways rather than to intercity or urban rail. When the federal government later had to confront the collapse of private passenger service, it created institutional remedies to preserve routes and manage subsidies. Yet the criminal case and subsequent policy choices left a lasting imprint. A documented, corporate-driven campaign to reconfigure urban transit markets, coupled with federal highway investment, that reshaped American mobility in favor of rubber tires and fuel suppliers. GM, Firestone, and Standard Oil systematically bought and dismantled trolley networks in 45 cities. During the early 20th century, a pattern of corporate acquisition reshaped urban transportation networks across the United States. National City Lines, a holding company backed by major manufacturers and petroleum interests, became the vehicle for a coordinated campaign. Investors including General Motors, Firestone Tire, and Standard Oil of California put capital into a chain that bought controlling interests in municipal and private streetcar operators. Official corporate records and court testimony show the tactics were systematic. Acquire a controlling block of stock through a local subsidiary, replace the electric rolling stock with buses, then secure the aftermarket by funneling purchases of buses, tires, and fuel to the parent company's factories and distributors. The mechanism was straightforward and lucrative. Local streetcar companies typically owned valuable real estate, tracks, overhead wiring, and operating franchises. Once bought out, these assets could be stripped, sold, or repurposed while bus fleets from the parent suppliers filled the routes. Documents from government investigations describe how subsidiaries negotiated exclusive purchasing arrangements for vehicles and parts, and how regional managers coordinated conversions across multiple cities to standardize fleets and maintenance practices. The result was a captive market. Transit operators that had once been independent now made recurring purchases from the very corporations that had financed their acquisition. The geographic reach was broad. Investigative findings and later government filings attribute acquisitions in a total of 45 municipalities to National City Lines and its affiliates. In many of those cities, track removal followed quickly after change of ownership, and bus routes were established with equipment manufactured or supplied by the investor firms. Public utility filings and municipal records from affected cities document franchise transfers, franchise buyouts, and the accounting entries that recorded sale proceeds and write-downs of electrical infrastructure. Court testimony brought into the public record laid out internal memos and investment strategies, showing that return on parts and consumables figured prominently in the financial models used to justify purchases. Government action eventually followed. The Department of Justice brought cases that produced trial records and verdicts. The official transcripts and judgments set out the charges, the defense arguments, and the rulings. Those records also reveal the limits of the legal remedies. Prosecutors secured convictions on conspiracy-related counts, but penalties were minor relative to the scale of the corporate investments. Still, the trial testimonies, corporate minutes, and municipal filings together provide a detailed paper trail. That trail illustrates not just isolated business deals, but a concerted pattern of buyouts, conversions, and ongoing supply arrangements that fundamentally altered the ownership and physical shape of urban transit in dozens of American cities. The highway subsidy. The federal highway finance engine was built around a dedicated revenue stream, a federal motor fuel excise tax that flows into the Highway Trust Fund and was structured to pay for construction and maintenance of a new interstate network. The tax on gasoline is 18.4 cents per gallon and on diesel 24.4 cents per gallon, rates set by federal law and collected at the wholesale level. Those sums, multiplied across billions of gallons of fuel sold each year, produced a reliable, politically popular pot of money whose purpose was explicitly roadway investment. From the outset, the federal program carried unusually generous cost-sharing terms that tilted incentives toward highways. For the interstate system, Congress authorized the federal government to shoulder the lion's share of construction costs, commonly cited as roughly a 90% federal contribution on primary interstate projects, leaving states to contribute a small matching share and to finance rights-of-way and associated work. States, eager to capture the federal match, issued tax-exempt municipal bonds and reallocated local revenues to support arterial construction, leveraging federal dollars into much larger capital programs at the state and local level. Tax policy widened the subsidy beyond direct construction dollars. Employer-provided parking and certain commuter benefits have been excluded from taxable income under federal rules, creating an implicit subsidy for driving by making the cost of commuting by car cheaper than it otherwise would be. In addition, municipal bond interest used to finance roads has been tax-exempt, lowering borrowing costs for highway projects relative to private investment in rail. Together, these fiscal choices, direct fuel taxes earmarked for roads, high federal cost share, tax exemptions on parking and municipal finance, established a structural advantage for highways in America's transportation economy. The practical effect was immediate and long-lasting. Local planners and state departments of transportation could count on federal matching funds and favorable tax treatment to justify wide boulevards, sprawling interchanges, and suburban road extensions. Meanwhile, passenger rail and urban transit systems faced a different fiscal reality. Infrastructure investment had to compete for discretionary appropriations, local bonds, or farebox revenue, without a dedicated federal excise tax backing capital programs. The mismatch showed up in mode after mode: investment priorities, land use decisions, and maintenance backlogs, shaping travel patterns for generations. Policy documents and audits from federal agencies have repeatedly documented periodic imbalances and shortfalls in the Highway Trust Fund, prompting transfers from the general fund and legislative patches. Those interventions underscore how political decisions about taxation and spending, more than pure engineering or consumer preference, determined which infrastructure grew and which atrophied. The highway subsidy was not a single check, but a web of tax rules, matching formulas, and financing tools that together redirected public resources and private development toward the automobile and away from rail as a primary passenger mode. In 1956, the U.S. picked a winner by pouring $25 billion into free highways for trucks. The Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 authorized a $25 billion construction program to create a 41-mile national system of interstate and defense highways, a scale of federal commitment to roads unseen before in U.S. history. Funding was organized through the newly created Highway Trust Fund, financed primarily by a federal gasoline tax set at 3 cents per gallon, and structured so the federal government would pay roughly 90% of construction costs while states covered the remainder. That formula concentrated purchasing power at the federal level and guaranteed steady revenue dedicated to highway building, removing the stop-and-start budgeting that had constrained large projects in the past. President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed the law after long personal advocacy. His support drew on both military logic and experiences with long-distance convoys, as well as admiration for Germany's Autobahn network observed during wartime. Official documents used defense language explicitly, branding the system as critical for national defense and commerce alike, a framing that helped secure broad political and public backing. The result was a massive, centrally funded program that accelerated construction across states, creating continuous, high-speed corridors optimized for motor vehicles. Because the highways were publicly financed and largely toll-free, they effectively lowered the cost of long-haul and local trucking in ways railroads, which had to maintain and finance their own rights-of-way, could not match. Trucking gained a practical advantage: door-to-door service on a network designed for speed and capacity, operating on pavement paid for by federal and state governments. Manufacturers and shippers shifted practices to take advantage of that flexibility. Suppliers could consolidate fewer inventories and rely on more frequent deliveries when reliable interstate routes were available nearby. The institutional legacy of the $25 billion authorization endured. The Highway Trust Fund created a durable funding stream that prioritized road investment, and federal planning centered on highways as the backbone of national mobility and freight movement. Those official choices, the funding level, the tax mechanism, the construction priorities, reshaped transportation economics, tilting competition toward trucks and away from privately maintained rail infrastructure and changing the logistics of American commerce for generations. The just-in-time trap. The production philosophy that prioritized minimal on-hand inventory found its earliest modern expression in Japan, where Toyota codified the just-in-time approach to reduce waste and synchronize supplier deliveries with assembly line needs. U.S. automakers began importing those principles in earnest as competitive pressure mounted. Manufacturers demanded smaller, more frequent shipments from suppliers, and logistics schedules tightened accordingly. Federal records show that as manufacturers restructured procurement practices, procurement lead times shrank and inventory carrying costs were driven down by industrial policy choices and corporate decisions alike. Road capacity built under the Federal Aid Highway Program amplified a mode shift that complemented just-in-time thinking. The Federal Interstate Program authorized roughly 41 miles of high-speed, limited-access highway, enabling trucks to offer door-to-door pickup and delivery on schedules that rail networks, designed for bulk routing and marshaling, could not match. Containerization, pioneered in commercial practice by Malcolm McLean in the mid-1950s, further lowered transloading costs and made mixed truck rail moves easier, but doorstep flexibility remained the truck's advantage. Official transportation statistics from the U.S. Department of Transportation document this modal dynamic. As logistics strategies favored smaller lots and tighter timing, trucking's role in first and last-mile delivery expanded substantially. Railroads reacted, and the reaction accelerated a structural change. Under regulatory and market pressures in the 1970s and into the post-deregulation era, rail carriers consolidated routes, curtailed branch lines, and shifted capital toward unit trains and intermodal ramps that handled large, predictable flows. The consequence for just-in-time customers was twofold. Carriers became more efficient at moving mass shipments, but less capable of serving many small, time-critical deliveries. Corporations that depended on steady, frequent replenishment found rail's revised business model incompatible with their production rhythms, and they moved freight to trucks and private fleets. Government reports and industry filings at the time cite declines in carload traffic for automotive parts and growth in less-than-truckload and truckload service requests as direct effects of those changing procurement practices. The long arc created a trap. Just-in-time achieved lower inventory costs but increased supply chain fragility, and the transportation system reorganized in ways that made rail a poor fit for the new norms. Analysts from the Government Accountability Office and the Department of Transportation have since underscored the trade-off between efficiency and resilience. When rail capacity was concentrated into fewer lanes and yards, outages or congestion yielded larger, cascading effects on production lines that had eliminated buffer stock. In practical terms, factories that once tolerated a missed rail car had stopped buying spare parts in advance, relying instead on scheduled deliveries that a shrinking rail network could no longer guarantee. The interplay of corporate inventory doctrine, public highway investment, containerized trade, and rail restructuring thus produced a self-reinforcing cycle. Just-in-time practices diminished rail's customer base, and rail's strategic retreat made just-in-time increasingly hostage to the faster but more congestible road network. America traded the massive efficiency of trains for the speed of door-to-door trucking. During the mid-20th century, the federal government committed unprecedented sums to building a national highway network, effectively underwriting a new logistics architecture centered on trucks delivering goods directly from factory doors to storefronts. The Federal Aid Highway Act authorized roughly $25 billion to construct about 41 miles of interstate standard highways, a concentrated public investment that lowered the marginal cost of long-haul and regional trucking by putting high-capacity pavement where private railroads had once carried the lion's share of long-distance freight. That spending reduced transit time for many shipments by eliminating transfers and delays inherent in rail yard operations, and it handed shippers a controllable, predictable door-to-door option that fit the growing expectations of retailers and manufacturers. Rail advocates and technical authorities pointed to stark efficiency contrasts that were ignored in the rush to highways. According to the Association of American Railroads, freight rail moves a ton of goods nearly 500 miles on a single gallon of diesel in typical conditions, a level of fuel efficiency several times that of heavy trucks. A single intermodal or unit train can carry the equivalent cargo of up to several hundred tractor-trailers, concentrating energy use and reducing labor and fuel per ton-mile. Yet those systemic advantages were undermined in practice because trains require terminals, transloading, and fixed-track routing. Trucking could bypass those steps and deliver directly to warehouses, factories, and retail outlets, shaving handling time even when using more fuel overall. Corporate strategy and public policy converged to accelerate the modal shift. Industrial players invested deliberately in road-based mobility. Automakers, oil companies, and tire manufacturers funneled capital into municipal transit conversions and road-friendly alternatives, and litigation later documented coordinated purchases of streetcar systems that were replaced with buses. The Department of Justice brought cases that led to convictions in the late 1940s for conspiracies related to the sale of buses and supplies, demonstrating that private actors actively restructured urban transport markets. Meanwhile, federal policy created asymmetries. Highways were financed primarily by taxpayers and built to federal standards, while railroads long paid privately for their tracks and faced tight regulatory constraints on pricing and service change under the Interstate Commerce Commission. Regulation and later deregulation tell part of the story of loss and partial recovery. Railroads were constrained in how they could price and abandon unprofitable lines, which left them unable to compete flexibly against trucking on many regional routes. The creation of a government-owned corporation to preserve intercity passenger service reflected the collapse of the commercial passenger railroad model, while later legislative reforms, intended to restore competitiveness, did not immediately reverse decades of modal migration. Official transportation statistics and agency reports show a sustained climb in truck freight for short and medium-haul moves, where door-to-door speed and schedule control mattered most to shippers. At the same time, rail retained its comparative advantage in long-haul bulk and intermodal corridors, where economies of scale and fuel efficiency could still be realized. Concrete examples make the trade-offs plain. A manufacturer choosing between a single consolidated rail shipment that saves fuel and labor but incurs terminal handling and schedule constraints, and a line-haul truck that picks up and drops off at the factory gate the same day, will often pick the truck if the value of time and inventory reduction exceeds the extra transport cost. Large retail chains and just-in-time suppliers embraced trucking to tighten supply chains. The result was a logistical culture built around speed and flexibility rather than raw ton-mile efficiency. Official analyses from the U.S. Department of Transportation and industry associations underline that policy choices, public funding priorities, antitrust enforcement outcomes, and regulatory regimes shaped these economic incentives, producing a transportation landscape where the massive efficiency of trains was routinely traded for the operational speed of door-to-door trucking. What we've traced tonight is not a single villain, but a web of policy, profit, and politics. Corporate-backed bus consolidation led by national city lines, financially tied to General Motors, Firestone, and oil companies, was convicted of conspiracy in 1949 for undermining streetcar systems. President Eisenhower's experience and Cold War priorities helped drive the 1956 Federal Aid Highway Act, which the Federal Highway Administration records show authorized roughly $25 billion to build. About 41,000 miles of interstate highways. The combined effect, documented in government archives and court files, was a rapid shift of public investment and travel patterns away from rail and streetcars and into cars, trucks, and buses, leaving passenger rail diminished until the emergency creation of Amtrak in 1971. Those are the concrete facts from official sources that explain how a transportation landscape that once relied on rails was reorganized around highways and private vehicles. You've followed the trail from corporate memos and court transcripts to the Federal Highway Administration's own numbers, and seen how policy choices and corporate actions produced outcomes that reshaped American cities and commuting for generations. If this story surprised you, imagine how different everyday life would have been if investments had gone the other way. If you want more, hit subscribe and like so you don't miss the next episode, where we'll dig into the rail rebound, how deregulation, freight innovations, and modern policy proposals have revived parts of the rail system, using data from the Federal Railroad Administration and the Association of American Railroads, to ask whether America can rebuild what was lost. Check the description for primary sources and court record we cited, leave a comment with what surprised you most, and share this video so more people can see how decisions from decades ago still shape our commutes, cities, and climate today.